Let me paint a picture that is probably going to give a lot of clinicians listening to this a knot in their stomach.
Oh, I can already guess where this is going.
Right. So you have been working with a client for months. You think they have completely, totally mastered a crucial daily living skill, let's say, washing their hands.
That's classic.
Yeah. You have taken the data, you wrote it up in the progress report, you even showed the parents how well they are doing, And then one day you send the client to the sink, but this time you stay across the room to take a quick note.
Mm-hmm.
And they just stand there, doing nothing, staring at the sink. And in that terrifying sinking moment, the realization hits you. They haven't actually mastered washing their hands.
No, they haven't.
They have mastered following you to the sink, waiting for you to slightly nod your head or point at the soap or, I don't know, raise your eyebrows. Prompt dependency is just the silent killer of clinical progress.
It absolutely is. And it happens because, well, clinicians often mistake compliance for mastery. Welcome to a high-level breakdown of BACB's 6th edition task list area G7.
We are diving deep into selecting and evaluating stimulus and response prompting procedures today.
Exactly. And my approach today is going to be straightforward, highly clinical, and completely focused on the exact mechanisms of behavior change. Whether you are an RBT in the trenches or a BCBD refining your supervisory skills, today is about moving from basic definitions to high-level clinical application.
Which is so needed.
Right. And frankly, giving you the Pearson VU exam logic you actually need. There's no fluff here. Every concept we unpack today is designed to teach or to convert.
I am so ready for it, because if you are working in behavior analysis, understanding how to use prompts and, more importantly, how to get rid of them is the entire ballgame.
It really is the whole job.
Yeah. So our mission for this deep dive is to dissect errorless learning, most to least to most, and prompt fading. But before we get into the complex fading procedures, I feel like we need to establish the foundational divide.
The basic mechanics.
Exactly. What exactly is the difference between a stimulus prompt and a response prompt? Because I know a lot of people mix these two up in practice.
They do, constantly.
Yeah.
And it really stems from a misunderstanding of where the prompt is actually applying its leverage. Let's look at the baseline definition.
Okay.
A prompt is a supplementary antecedent stimulus. We introduce it to evoke a correct response in the presence of a discriminative stimulus, the natural SD.
Yeah.
But here is the divide response prompts operate directly on the behavior itself.
Meaning you are physically intervening on the person.
Exactly. You are intervening on what the learner is doing. This includes physical guidance, modeling, and verbal instructions. Stimulus prompts, conversely, operate directly on the antecedent stimulus itself.
So changing the environment.
Right. You are changing the environment to make the SDE more prominent or obvious.
Mm-hmm.
That includes positioning, movement, or pairing, and redundancy.
Okay, let me try to map this out with an analogy to see if I'm tracking the mechanism here, because it can get dense.
Go for it. Let's hear it.
So, if I am teaching someone to swing a golf club, a response prompt is me stepping in and physically adjusting their grip, or maybe standing next to them and demonstrating the swing myself.
Yes, modeling or physical guidance.
Right, because I am operating directly on their physical response. But a stimulus prompt would be if I took a bright neon sticker and placed it right on the center of the golf ball so they focus their eyes directly on where the club needs to strike.
That is a perfect example of redundancy.
Because I haven't touched their body or demonstrated anything, right? I have fundamentally altered the stimulus, the ball, to draw their behavior out.
That is exactly the distinction. In the first scenario, you are manipulating the topography of their behavior. In the second, you're manipulating the physical dimensions of the environment to make the natural SD impossible to ignore.
But let me push back on something you mentioned a moment ago, because this feels like a gray area that trips people up all the time.
I love pushback. What is it?
You categorized verbal instructions as response prompts. If I look at the learner holding the golf club and I say, hit the ball, isn't my voice a stimulus in their environment?
It is an auditory stimulus, yes.
So why isn't that a stimulus prompt? I am putting a sound into the environment.
It is a brilliant question, and honestly, it is one of the most common traps for clinicians taking the exam. Yes, technically your voice is an auditory stimulus, but we have to look at what the prompt is directly modifying.
Okay, modifying the behavior versus the environment.
Right. Let me give you a clinical scenario to explain the psychology behind this. Imagine I show you a picture of a dog, and my goal is for you to say the word dog.
Simple enough.
But underneath the picture, the word is written in Russian text. Now, assuming you cannot read Russian, that visual text That stimulus modification offers you absolute zero help.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because I have no learning history with the Russian alphabet. It's just squiggles to me.
Exactly. It does not make the correct vocal response any more obvious to you. The stimulus was altered, but it didn't evoke the behavior.
Right. It didn't tell me what to do.
Now imagine I use a verbal prompt. I look at you and I say dog. I am directly cueing the topography of the response you need to emit.
Because you bypass the picture entirely.
Precisely. I have not changed the physical dimensions of the natural SD. The picture of the dog is still just a picture of a dog. The verbal prompt acts as a supplementary instruction dictating the behavior.
Yeah.
It tells the response what to do, so verbal prompts are always Raymond's prompts.
Okay, the mechanism there makes perfect sense. It's all about what you are targeting, the environment or the action.
Exactly. It's a functional distinction, not just a topographical one.
Let's ground this in some day-to-day ABA clinic examples. Think about a learner, let's call her Lynn. Lynn is having difficulty writing her name.
A very common early learner goal.
Right. If her teacher takes Lynn's hand and physically guides her pencil to write the letters, that is a response prompt. You are literally hands-on with the optimal behavior.
Precisely. You are forcing the response topography. And let's look at a stimulus prompt, specifically redundancy, because you see this constantly in technology and game design.
Oh, like video games.
Yeah, think about a video game where you need to interact with a specific door to advance. And the designers make that door glow with a pulsing, shiny light.
Right, so you know exactly where to go.
Exactly. That shininess highlights a specific feature of the stimulus, making the player much more likely to walk toward it. Translating that to a clinical communication goal, imagine placing a bright, tactile, textured sticker on a specific icon on an AEC device.
To cue a client to push that specific button.
Yes, the physical dimension of the device, the stimulus, has been artificially altered to evoke the target behavior.
Which is incredibly effective for getting the behavior to happen the first time. But, putting a prompt in place is the easy part.
Anybody can prompt.
Right. Any clinician can slap a neon sticker on a button or grab a learner's hand, but getting rid of that prompt without the behavior collapsing, that is where clinicians truly earn their keep.
It separates the elite clinicians from the average ones.
So why is the fading process so critical? Why can't we just leave the prompts in place if they are working and the client is succeeding?
Because if you leave the prompt in place, they aren't working. This brings us to a major clinical power insight: stimulus control transfer.
That's the ultimate goal, right?
The ultimate non-negotiable goal of all prompting is to transfer control from your artificial supplementary prompt over to the natural SD in the environment. Think of prompts like training wheels on a bicycle.
I love that analogy.
If you leave the training wheels on indefinitely, the child doesn't actually learn how to balance a two-wheeled bicycle. They learn how to ride a tricycle.
Yeah, the mechanics are totally different.
Exactly. If you do not systematically fade your prompts, you manufacture a prompt-dependent learner. You, the clinician, become the SD, instead of the natural environment being the SD.
Which takes us right back to my nightmare scenario at the sink. The client wasn't responding to the dirty hands. They were responding to the clinician.
They were just waiting for you to steer the tricycle.
Oh, that's so true. So how do we systematically execute that transfer? Let's unpack response prompt fading first. How do we pull the training wheels off?
One of the most highly tested and clinically powerful methods for physical response prompts is graduated guidance. This involves systematically fading the physical support you are providing.
So starting heavy and backing off.
Right. You start with a necessary physical prompt, say, hand over hand, full physical guidance to help a learner scoop food with a spoon. As the learner begins to initiate the movement, you immediately fade your physical contact.
Okay, so you move back.
You move your hands from their hand, back to their forearm, then back to their elbow, then to the shoulder.
Wait, let me stop you there because I have seen this go wrong in practice so many times.
Oh, I'm sure you have. It's botched constantly.
Wait. If I am fading from the hand to the forearm to the elbow to the shoulder, and then eventually I am just like hovering my hands behind them, aren't I still prompting them?
You absolutely are.
Because how does the learner actually know I have backed off? Couldn't my physical shadow just become a new, slightly less intrusive visual or spatial prompt?
That is an incredibly sharp observation, and it highlights a critical failure point in practice.
Yeah.
Yes, your physical proximity can easily become a spatial prompt.
So they just learn to wait for the hover.
Exactly. That is exactly why graduated guidance isn't just about removing touch. It requires a rapid, fluid assessment of proprioceptive feedback. When you are hovering, You are shadowing the learner's movement, ready to jump back in the millisecond they pause or initiate an error.
And you can't stay there.
No, you must systematically remove yourself from their personal space entirely. The shadowing is only meant to be a temporary bridge to ensure behavioral momentum doesn't crash while the physical touch is faded.
So the hover is just a split-second safety net.
Right. If you hover for 3 weeks, you haven't faded the prompt, you just changed its topography.
That distinction is massive. You can't just hover forever. The hover is a safety net you are actively pulling away.
Beautifully said.
What about time delay? Because this one fascinates me from a psychological perspective.
Time delay is incredibly powerful when executed with precision. You present the natural SD, and then you deliberately wait a specific amount of time before giving the response prompt.
So just staring at them.
Essentially. Initially, you start with a 0-second delay. You present the SD and the prompt simultaneously, but then you introduce either a fixed or progressive delay.
Give me an example of the delay in action.
For instance, you present the natural SD, you wait exactly 3 seconds, and if they don't respond independently, you deliver the prompt.
I am struggling to understand what is actually happening in the learner's brain during that 3-second silence, though.
It's all about shifting the contingency.
But what if they just realize, hey, if I just sit here for 3 seconds, this lady's going to do the work for me? How does silence actually evoke independence?
Silence is highly evocative. When you present the natural SD and then just wait, you are opening a window where independent responding contacts a much denser, richer schedule of reinforcement.
Oh, so the reinforcement has to change based on when they respond.
Exactly. A skilled clinician will provide massive, high-magnitude praise or reinforcement for an independent response that occurs during the delay window and only provide a mediocre baseline reinforcer if the learner waits for the prompt.
So it's about behavioral economics.
Yes. The learner quickly assesses the behavioral economics of the situation. They realize, if I initiate this action now, before the prompt comes, the payoff is significantly better.
You are basically calling their bluff and letting the natural contingency do the heavy lifting.
You are making independence profitable.
Okay, that makes total sense. You are tilting the scales, so independence is simply more profitable than waiting for help. That covers response prompts. What about stimulus fading?
With stimulus fading, you are systematically changing the physical dimensions of the antecedent stimulus over time until only the natural SD remains.
Yeah. Like fading out a visual.
Exactly. The classic, universally understood example is teaching handwriting. First, the learner traces a solid, bold letter A. Then, you fade that physical dimension. The next worksheet has a dotted line letter A.
So the stimulus itself is actually breaking down.
All right. The next one has just 3 dots mapping the points of the letter. And finally, they are writing the letter independently on a blank piece of paper. The artificial dimension of the stimulus was systematically stripped away.
So if the ultimate goal of all these procedures is getting rid of the prompt, it brings up a broader strategic question.
Which is?
How do we decide how to introduce the prompt in the first place? Are we building them up with heavy support from the start, or are we letting them try, maybe fail, and then catching them?
That question represents the fundamental dividing line between errorless learning and the least to most approach. Let's analyze errorless learning first.
Okay, what's the clinical definition there?
In clinical terms, errorless learning utilizes most to least prompting with a strict 0-second delay. You are jumping in immediately with the most intrusive prompt necessary to ensure the learner performs the behavior perfectly.
So you are actively preventing the learner from making a mistake.
100%.
But why? I mean, in everyday life, we always say people learn from their mistakes. Why are we so terrified of letting a learner get it wrong?
Because in behavior analysis, we understand that every behavior that occurs is building a reinforcement history. As B.F. Skinner famously noted, errors are not necessary for learning to occur.
Right, they just add baggage.
Exactly. If you allow a learner to practice an error, you are allowing neural pathways for the wrong behavior to fire and strengthen. It can create emotional responding, frustration, and a chain of incorrect behaviors that you now have to spend weeks unteaching.
Oh, I've been there. Unteaching a skill is a nightmare.
It's the worst. So errorless learning builds a massive, dense history of reinforcement for the correct behavior from trial 1.
It's like paving a superhighway for the correct response, so the brain doesn't even consider taking the dirt road.
That's a great way to look at it.
But there has to be a downside. Why wouldn't we just use errorless learning for every single client all the time?
Because it is incredibly heavy-handed. It requires massive clinical resources. It can cause prompt dependency if the fading isn't executed flawlessly. And frankly, some learners will physically resist highly intrusive prompts.
Right, not everyone wants you grabbing their hands.
Exactly. That is where least to most prompting comes in. I call this the do-over method. You give the learner an opportunity to perform the task independently first, responding only to the natural SD.
Giving them the dignity of risk.
Yes. If they fail, or if they don't respond within a set window, you introduce the absolute least intrusive prompt, perhaps a subtle visual cue.
And if they still don't get it?
When they still fail, you escalate to a verbal cue, then a model, and finally physical guidance only as a last resort.
So least to most lets them contact the natural contingencies first. It gives them the dignity of trying independently, and you only scale up your intervention if they prove they need it.
Precisely.
This feels like an area where clinicians, and especially test takers, fall into some serious conceptual traps.
Oh, the traps are everywhere.
Yeah.
Let's break down the most common clinical pitfalls, which directly mirror what you will see on the exam.
Lay 'em on me.
The first trap is defaulting to most to least unnecessarily. Clinicians love the control of errorless learning. But clinically, least to most should actually be your default prompting technique.
Wait, really? Least to most should be the default.
Yes, the only exceptions are if the learner has a documented history of rapid skill acquisition using most to least, or if errorless learning is strictly required to prevent the practicing of severe, dangerous, or highly regressive errors. Otherwise, you want to give learners the chance to respond independently.
That makes sense. We don't want to smother the learner with support if they are capable of initiating on their own. What is the next trap? Because I imagine identifying these prompts in a chaotic clinic room is harder than it sounds.
The next trap is catastrophic for data collection, confusing the SD with the prompt. Let's talk about chores, because this happens with parents all the time.
Oh, parent consultation, always a minefield.
Always. Let's say the target behavior is taking out the trash. The natural SD for taking out the trash is noticing that the garbage bin in the kitchen is overflowing.
Right. Seeing the full bin is the cue.
But parents will say, I have to tell him to take out the trash every single day. He knows how to do it. I just have to remind him.
Ah, I hear that constantly.
Right. The verbal prompt, the parent saying take out the garbage, is artificial. Clinicians and parents trap themselves by thinking that the verbal command is the natural SD.
Oh, wow. That is a subtle but massive realization. The parent thinks they are just giving a reminder, but their nagging has actually become the SD for the behavior.
Exactly. If the client only takes out the trash when you vocally tell them to, they have not mastered the skill under the control of the natural environment. They are completely prompt dependent on your voice.
So the bin full of trash means nothing to them.
Nothing at all. Your verbal instruction means everything.
Okay, that changes how you have to write every single goal in a treatment plan. You have to explicitly define what the natural SD is supposed to be.
Exactly. Otherwise, you're just measuring compliance to prompts.
Is there another trap we need to watch for?
Yes. Misclassifying physical prompts. We touched on this earlier, but clinicians sometimes think that because physical guidance involves touching the client and physically moving their hand toward an object, it must be acting on the stimulus.
Because they are moving toward the stimulus.
Right, but it absolutely is not. Physical guidance acts strictly on the response. You are physically manipulating the topography of the behavior, not the physical dimensions of the antecedent stimulus.
All right, let's translate all of this clinical nuance directly into exam strategy. If I am sitting down to take my board exam, how is Pearson VUE going to test this logic?
They're going to test your ability to cut through the noise of a scenario and identify the exact mechanism at play. Here is the direct if-then-test logic you must lock in.
I'm ready. Give me the elite educator breakdown.
If you see a test question where the instructor prevents any incorrect responding from happening by using immediate, highly intrusive prompts right at the gate, choose errorless learning, or most to least.
Immediate, intrusive, preventing errors. The superhighway. Got it.
Next, if you see a scenario where the learner is explicitly given a chance to respond first without any help, and then assistance is systematically added only after they fail or pause, choose least to most.
The do-over method. Independent chance first, then escalate the intervention.
Exactly. And finally, if you see a scenario describing the fading of physical contact, specifically moving from the hand to the forearm to the elbow to the shoulder, choose graduated guidance.
Hand, elbow, shoulder equals graduated guidance. That is incredibly precise.
You have to be precise on the exam.
So, to pull all of this together regarding task list area G7, Mastering this domain means knowing the exact mechanical difference between a stimulus prompt and a response prompt.
Mm-hmm.
It means knowing how to systematically pull those training wheels off to achieve stimulus control transfer. And it means knowing exactly when to deploy the heavy, preventative architecture of errorless learning versus the opportunity-driven, escalating approach of least to most prompting.
That is the exact level of clinical precision required to change behavior and pass the exam. If this helped you, follow behavioral intelligence, share this episode with another RBT or BCBA who's studying, and leave a comment or review. That's how we grow and how I keep creating high-level content for you.
At Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc., we build clinicians, not just test passers. Visit www.amethysttherapyservices.com or reach out at info@amethysttherapyservices.com to connect. I want to leave you with one final, slightly uncomfortable thought as we wrap up today's deep dive.
Oh, this should be good.
We just spent this entire time talking about how to fix prompt dependency in our clients. But think about your own life for a second. Are you responding to natural SDs in your environment, or have you become highly prompt dependent yourself?
That is a tough question to answer, honestly.
Right. Think about your phone's notifications, your GPS telling you exactly when and where to turn, your calendar alerts popping up to command you to log into a meeting.
We are all prompted constantly.
Exactly. You are likely functioning under a massive invisible web of artificial prompts. How would you design your own environment to transfer stimulus control back to natural cues? Are you the master of your environment or just a product of its prompts? Think about it.